Okay, so this part of chapter 3 focuses primarily on the brain and then Piaget and information processing. All right, so in this neuroconstructivist view, then we're basically looking at the brain and how it is constructed. And according to this particular view, the brain depends on experience to determine how connections are made. So after birth, following all of the experiences that the infant has of sight, sound, smell, touch, language, eye contact, all of these things help to shape the brain's neural connections. And then throughout the lifespan, these factors continue to help shape the brain. So the brain is plastic, and in terms of plastic, we're talking about the brain being responsive to experience. So in terms of how does the brain respond to experience, so hopefully you recognize this. It's a neuron, which is the basic building block of the brain cells. I will post a video that tells how neurons communicate, so I won't go over that here, but I'll share the video with you. And then in terms of the neuron, we're going to be looking at white matter, which is the myelinated axons, and then gray matter, which are the dendrites and the cell body of the neuron. So in terms of developmental changes in adolescence, there's an increase in white matter and a decrease in gray matter in the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is that part of the frontal lobe. It's located right behind your forehead, and from an evolutionary standpoint, it's the most advanced. It's the seat of planning, judgment, decision making, and is not fully developed until around age 25, so among the last areas of the brain to develop also. So big changes that we see then in adolescence are increases in this white matter and decreases in gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, primarily due to increased myelination, and then this helps with overall development in that area. So this is part of the reason that we see adolescents becoming better at inhibiting impulses and better at making complex decisions. All right, so then in terms of neurons, some of the important processes that happen are called synaptogenesis. So with synaptogenesis, the basic idea is that the connections that we use the most often become increasingly connected. So think about something that you do on a regular basis, like driving a car. So when you first started driving, you probably had to think about it a lot, but now because you've done it so often, you can do it pretty much without thinking. And so that represents that increased connection among neurons because you're doing that activity over and over and over again. So that's synaptogenesis. The other thing that we find also is that there is a significant amount of pruning in the adolescent brain. So pruning basically means that we get rid of pathways, get rid of connections that we don't need anymore. And part of the reason that we do this in the brain is so that the pathways that we do need, the things that we do rely on, such as knowing how to drive, so that those pathways can function more efficiently. So we have to get rid of the unused ones so that the other ones can be more efficient. All right, so we're going to talk then about Piaget and his theory of cognitive development. So as you hopefully remember from other classes, there are 4 stages in Piaget's theory. You see them demonstrated here. We are going to focus for this class on stage 4, which is the formal operational stage. So some background then, in Piaget's theory, he talks about several individual features that allow thinking to advance and allow thinking to become more sophisticated as children move into adolescence. So he talks first about a schema. Schema are basically mental concepts, a framework for organizing information. A schema is essentially an understanding of how something goes or how something works. So for example, you have a schema for when you come into class. You come to class before the class starts, you choose a seat, you sit down, you get out your notebook, you get out your computer, you have something to write with. If you want to ask a question, you raise your hand. All of those things would be considered a schema, right? Or an organized network of your understanding of what happens in class. Piaget also talks about two processes that advance cognitive development: assimilation and accommodation. With assimilation, we are using the same scheme to interpret the world around us. With accommodation, we have to change our scheme to incorporate new information from the world around us. So, for example, if you have a child who goes to the zoo for the first time and the child sees a tiger and the child points at the tiger and says, "Kitty," that child is using assimilation. So understanding that a tiger does have some similarity with kitties. It has fur, it has whiskers, it has forelegs, it has a tail, and the child is trying to absorb that new information of the tiger into the existing scheme for cat. However, to advance cognitive development, the child needs to actually accommodate that information, which would mean changing their understanding of the difference between perhaps a household cat and a cat that you don't want in your house, like a tiger. So understanding how those two things are very different from one another. And then equilibration, our last concept here in Piaget's theory. So for Piaget, then, this is essentially moving from one thought to another. And so to make sense of the world, then, adolescents organize their experiences and adapt their thinking to include new ideas. So for Piaget, then, we are going to focus on stage 4, which is the formal operational stage. The major thing that happens during this stage is the development of abstract thinking. So abstract thinking involves being able to think about things that you cannot see or you cannot touch, such as the ideas of justice or love, and also to be able to reason about things that you've never personally experienced. So adolescents can do this actually quite well. There is also this increased tendency for adolescents to be able to think about their thinking, which is called metacognition, and also part of this formal operational stage is the ability to use what we call hypothetical deductive reasoning, which is basically following a prescribed series of steps. So think the scientific method is a good example of this, to develop some kind of hypothesis and then to test it out and arrive at some kind of conclusion. So in Piaget's theory, then, there is argument that not all adolescents are actually full-fledged formal operational thinkers. So not all adolescents are there when Piaget's theory states that they should be. Some developmental theorists instead argue that this formal operational period should actually be divided into two separate subperiods. So in this early formal operational thought, we're looking at being able to think in hypothetical ways, but it produces thought that is kind of unconstrained, perhaps too subjective, so too much from my perspective, and too idealistic. So they're primarily using assimilation, so incorporating new information into what they already know. And then the second half, this late formal operational thought, using accommodation, so changing their schemas to make sense of this new information, and then using that to be able to test their reasoning, which is typically more in line with reality. There is, though, some research that shows that a lot of college students and many adults don't really think in this formal operational way on a regular basis. So in terms of evaluating Piaget's theory, some specific criticisms here. So although Piaget really was the first person to talk about the differences between adults and children's and adolescents' thinking, there are some shortcomings here. So he essentially underestimated the thinking abilities that children and adolescents have. He, kind of downplayed many of the capacities that they have. Adolescent cognitive development also is probably not as stage-like as Piaget indicated. And then additionally, culture seems to exert a huge influence here. So in cultures where formal operational thinking is prized, so think in Western type cultures where adolescents are attending a Western style high school, it makes sense for them to develop formal operational thinking. But in the absence of those kinds of conditions, oftentimes we see that both adolescents and adults are typically thinking in Piaget's stage 3, which is the concrete operations stage. All right, so let's talk about some of the changes then in terms of cognition into adulthood. So Piaget's theory ends with stage 4. So he basically says that formal operations is the height of thinking. That is where you develop as an adolescent, and then you stay there for the rest of your life. More recent challengers, though, have proposed that perhaps there is a 5th stage, what they call post-formal thought. So post-formal thought is supposed to reflect the complexities of the type of thinking that adults typically do based on the kinds of problems that we face in real life. So this type of thinking in contrast with formal operations. So with formal operations, remember we talked about that hypothetico-deductive reasoning, which basically states if you follow this certain series of steps, you will arrive at some kind of conclusion. Well, many of the problems that we encounter as adults do not necessarily have that kind of step-by-step formulaic approach. So many of the problems that we solve as adults maybe don't really have a one right or wrong answer. Oftentimes, the decisions that we make just involve kind of weighing the pros and the cons and then making what we think is the best decision possible. So for example, if you were thinking about what kind of car to buy, there's probably not a one right answer to that question, as there are many, many different cars, and any number of cars could fit what you want in a car. So you do some shopping, you do the pros and the cons of each different type, and then you arrive at a conclusion that's probably the best for you. It doesn't mean that that's the only solution to the problem, though. So that's one of the ways that post-formal thinking might actually be very different from the formal operational thought. All right, so one other theory that you will see associated with cognitive development is the theory of Lev Vygotsky. So this is really popular in education, but Vygotsky's theory essentially looks at the social context of cognitive development through this concept of what he calls the zone of proximal development. Okay, so the zone of proximal development, the ZPD. So the basic idea is that there are a certain number of things that I can do all by myself. So this is stuff that I can do unaided. I don't need any help. The zone of proximal development is what is just outside my reach of what I can do alone, but if someone helps me, that means that I can probably do it. And then there are still things that are outside of that zone of proximal development, things that even if I do have help, I'm probably not going to be able to do these things. So for example, we might have, let's say, calculus. So you can do some math unaided, right? So basic addition, subtraction, things like that. You might not be able to solve calculus problems by yourself. However, with the help of someone who knows more about calculus than you, so this could be a professor, this could be a teacher, this could be a tutor, that person can help you be able to now understand calculus. So that would be within your zone of proximal development. Beyond that, let's say very complex astrophysics problems, those might be beyond your capacity. Even with someone helping you, that's probably beyond most of our reach. So that's the basic idea in Vygotsky's theory, that we advance in terms of our cognitive development through interacting with other people. So it pays more attention to the contextual factors in learning compared to Piaget's theory. All right, so let's talk about attention, because there are some pretty significant changes that happen in terms of attention for adolescents. So in terms of the aspects of attention, being able to concentrate, being able to focus, adolescents become better at what we call selective attention. So selective is being able to focus on what's important and tuning out the other stuff. Divided attention, being able to shift attention between two things. Sustained attention, being able to focus on something for long periods of time. And then executive attention, which is the ability to determine kind of what is the most important thing that I need to focus on. So lucky for us, adolescents see leaps and bounds in terms of improvement here. A lot of this is also probably due to development in that prefrontal cortex area of the brain. Right, so in terms of studying adolescent attention, one of the things that is getting a lot of attention, recently is this study of multitasking. And so with multitasking, basically most people cannot do this. A more accurate term might be switch tasking, where we switch between two different things. Adolescents think they become better at this, and they do compared to young children, but the ability to truly focus on two things at one time is outside the reach of most people, not just adolescents, but adults as well. However, their increase in this executive attention supports their ability to use what we call effortful control, which is essentially kind of like a self-control, kind of controlling those cognitive resources so that they can multitask and engage in these more complex academic tasks that characterize middle school and also high school in terms of the work that they do. All right, so memory, this is also something that is central to understanding cognitive development in adolescence. So this is hopefully a review for you from your intro psychology class. But according to this particular model, remember that there are 3 stages. So the first one is the sensory memory. So sensory meaning information that you take in with your 5 senses. So this is hearing something, seeing something, etc. We hold on to this for a very, very short period of time unless we determine that it's important enough to pass on, and then we pass it on into this short-term memory. Okay, so short-term memory. So short-term memory, limited in terms of capacity. We can only hold between 5 and 9 individual pieces of information here at any one given time. And typically when we're holding information in short-term memory, we are actively working with it. So sometimes you'll also hear this referred to as working memory. So this could be, for example, I'm trying to remember a list of things that I want to buy at the grocery store, and so I keep repeating the list over and over and over again. So I want butter, I want bread, I want milk, I want eggs, butter, bread, milk, eggs. Okay, so that would be an example of actively working with that information in my short-term memory. If I determine that this information in short-term memory is important enough, I want to hold on to it, I send it on to the final stop, which is long-term memory. Okay, so long-term memory is stop number 3. So long-term memory, in theory, it is infinite in capacity. You can hold as much information here as humanly possible. And what happens then is memory kind of goes from sensory to short-term into long-term, and then from long-term we have to be able to retrieve it. So that means be able to access that information when we need it. So if I ask you to remember the name of your first grade teacher, maybe you haven't thought about that in a really long time, but now you can think about it, you can retrieve that information, you can get to it, and then pass it on to short-term memory to tell me, oh, Mrs. Sipple was my first grade teacher's name. So one of the other kind of major things that's happening here in terms of adolescent development is the development of what we call executive functioning, right, or executive control. So executive basically means that it is overseeing other subordinate processes, so other kind of lower level processes. So for adolescents, huge advances here, especially in terms of how that prefrontal cortex is functioning, that allow them to be able to exercise cognitive control. So they can determine what they want to pay attention to and what they don't want to pay attention to, what they want to remember and what they don't want to remember, how they want to use that information, weighing the pros and the cons to make a decision, to think critically, to be creative in terms of their thought, and then also to think about their own thinking. So that's that process of metacognition. Executive functioning advances hugely during adolescence. We become much better at being able to kind of control our own thought, control our own behavior, and all of these things that go along with executive functioning capacities.